brave Irish people, wherever you
Have you
be.
guys ever been new to a place? Maybe first day of school, maybe you were new to that school. So let's go meet my friend Bridget.
The museum is always looking to represent the diversity of the building, and so it was important to tell an Irish story for that reason. The museum, as part of its research into Irish residents of 97 Orchard Street, discovered the story of Joseph and Bridget Moore, Irish immigrants who called 97 Orchard Street home in 1869. One of the documents that helped place the Moores here at 97 Orchard Street was an 1869 city directory that listed Joseph P. Moore as a waiter living here in that particular year. Interestingly, listed directly above Joseph P. Moore, waiter at 97 Orchard Street, was another Joseph Moore. He didn't live here at 97 Orchard Street, and in fact, he didn't live on the Lower East Side at all. He lived on the other side of town. He was also a waiter, but the other thing that really distinguished him in the city directory was he was listed as colored.
When I saw that information, the racial designation, I thought, what a great opportunity to have a conversation about how we find common ground between these two Joseph Moores.
As taken as I have always been with how the museum tells real stories of real people who lived in our iconic buildings, I had always felt that there was a big hole in our tapestry because we were not telling the stories of any Black Americans, any African Americans.
It's such a gift to have the two Joseph Moores, both waiters, in different spaces in the city, but both sharing the same city. And that is the truth of their lives, is that they are both there at the same moment, dealing with similar political change. And so thinking about what it meant for them to have the same name and to have a really different trajectory is really important, and a really important opportunity for the museum.
I think we'll really be able to learn something new about the stories of Irish New York and Black New York in the 19th century by looking at these stories in concert or together.
Joseph Moore is originally from New Jersey. He's from an area called Oxford Township, which is in a smaller town called Belvedere. It's in the countryside, very rural, but he also grew up in an area that had a sizable free Black population. So he was born free and had other community members in addition to his family that were born free. Most people don't realize that slavery happened in the North. And then when they do consider slavery in the North in comparison to the South, they think it's more benign. But there are examples of stories that show us that slavery was very much still traumatic and dehumanizing for African Americans. One example that we see this is through a newspaper article. In this article, there's a reporting of how even though people are free, there are people kidnapping African Americans and selling them south. The community is so small, I'm sure that Joseph Moore knew of this man who was pushed out and to go into hiding. What if one day someone potentially wrongfully accused them of being fugitive bondspeople? And so that could be also very much one of the reasons why he wanted to leave.
Someone like Joseph Moore might have had on his mind for a long time that he wanted to move to New York and be in a big city, try a different kind of job, be in a more urban setting, a place with multiple Black churches, a place where Black land ownership might be more possible.
The 8th Ward, in which Joseph and Rachel Moore find themselves living in 1870 and earlier on Lawrence Street, were part of a mixed community, but one that was filled with other Black or African American New Yorkers.
Other parts of the family that we encounter are Joseph Moore's parents, where his mother is remarried, and also his brother.
Coming to New York as part of a family group also brings some very valuable potential safety. You know, you can share wages. You can, if there are young children, perhaps you can share childcare. The more people you have who come to a relatively unknown place together, the better chance of survival you have. And of course, this is going to be very similar to what we know about immigrants from Europe, who also try to bring family groups with them so that they can pool all kinds of resources and create a more stable place for themselves in this city. By the 1840s, you're beginning to see the really massive immigration of Irish in particular into New York. And Irish and African Americans are going to fight for the next several decades for the lowest rung of the economic ladder. New York itself is a very complicated place around the issues of race and slavery. And so immigrants coming into New York were coming into maybe a land of freedom for themselves. But that freedom, as was true for the rest of the United States, was often positioned in opposition to Black freedom.
Thinking about Joseph Moore's family and starting off, who's in the home, we have Rachel Moore. Rachel Moore is not listed with the occupation. She's keeping house, which for at this time is exceptionally rare. Most Black women at this point are working either as washerwomen, they are domestics, and they're working where most families together are working. So we know that Joseph Moore is a waiter, and in the mid-19th century, being a waiter is the top occupation for African Americans, at least African American men.
So the occupation of waiter is a very interesting one in this time period. Being a waiter is actually a relatively skilled position. The other interesting thing about waiters during this time, Black waiters, is that they actually made a really good living. By the 1850s, they were often paid more than white waiters because they had fought for those wages. When the Irish come into New York, however, they began to compete with Black waiters for these jobs. And as we move towards the Civil War, white patrons of these restaurants and fancy places began to say that they don't want to be served by Black people anymore. And so we see Black people losing jobs as waiters, even though it had been a very good job for them for a long time. By the time of the Civil War, Irish were beginning to become accustomed to, quote, the wages of whiteness. The idea, if they agreed to behave as other white people in the US and to dismiss African Americans, to see themselves as better than African Americans, they would get the psychological wage of whiteness, which was to feel superior to this group of people. And also, they would gain jobs, they would gain political access. And all of these things squeezed African Americans out of the picture, even as the nation was heading into civil war, a war that would eventually result in the freedom of 4 million African Americans.
In considering the impact of the Civil War on Joseph Moore's life and how that may have shaped his trajectory, or even whether he viewed New York City as a secure location that could be home, we know first that there starts to be more reports of tension between Irish or just even white immigrant New Yorkers and Black New Yorkers. Maybe he's dealing with discrimination. He's kind of coming into New York as the population is shifting. It's almost the calm before the storm, really, of the draft riots. And the draft riots are what really changed things. The draft riots occurred in July of 1863, and what this was a response to was anger regarding the unfair policies for the draft of the Civil War. With this draft, it wasn't, equitable lottery of, men over the age of 18, but instead you could pay a fee, you would not be drafted. And so as you can imagine, in 1863, this is disadvantaging a lot of white immigrants living in New York, like the Irish. And understanding why the Civil War is happening, blame got shifted to African Americans, and for that reason, that's when African Americans themselves became a target. They're watching their homes be damaged, as well as seeing neighbors be murdered for this, senseless violence. The violence had consequences that I'm sure can still be felt today, where it forever shaped and kind of altered how Black New Yorkers saw New York as a home, even those who may have been descended from the original Black New Yorkers that were brought here by the Dutch. You have Black New Yorkers taking this moment where the city cannot protect them, they are already treated poorly. They decide to leave, and some that even stay still have to consider, how can I make this home? Will this place as in New York ever be a true home where I can feel like I belong and I'm a part of this community?
That they were still there in 1869 is also significant. They had, to some degree, made their peace as best they could with what had happened in New York in the draft riots, and were looking to be part of the new New York.
Maybe he was one of the fortunate African Americans who did have Irish alliances that allowed him to be protected, because his neighbors are Irish or just interracial in general. He may have still been able to see these groups being able to coexist.
The 1870 census enumerations for the 8th Ward, particularly the area around Lawrence Street that Joseph and Rachel Moore called home, it records 80 Irish Black households where the husband is a Black man and the presumed wife is an Irish-born woman. It suggests just by the very fact that this community was still there in 1870, that it was stable, that there was something that was working for these families. And there may have been other sort of community institutions that centered them there. Black churches, mutual aid societies, other kinds of forms of leisure.
There are definitely dance halls and bars and other businesses that are for African Americans, that are run by African Americans. The other place that African Americans form community is through mutual aid societies, in which Black men or Black women contribute monthly fees. If you became sick, you could appeal to the society to pay part of your wages until you became better, and so you would have a little bit of a safety net to support you. These are people who had skills, who knew things. African Americans actually tended to be more literate than other groups at their same economic level. African Americans had built churches and schools. They went to night school and Sunday school to learn how to read. As a group, they really struggled to advance and struggled successfully in many ways, but whites continued to underemploy them. And that underemployment, that lack of access to jobs and occupations equivalent to their actual skills and knowledge persisted in New York. One of the challenging things when we look at the two Joseph Moores is how different their paths to voting and citizenship were in this time period. African American men could not vote unless they held $200 in property. This was a law that was put into place as African Americans gained freedom from slavery in New York. And it was a way to limit their impact on state politics. So we have, again, another way in which African Americans' citizenship was limited in the state. In contrast, once Irish people were naturalized, became citizens, they could vote immediately. There was no problem there. They did not have a property requirement. It would be interesting to know whether or not Joseph Moore was politically active. There are African Americans who do form politically based clubs from the time of emancipation forward. They support politicians who they think are anti-slavery. Even when Black men can't vote in large numbers, they support candidates who promise to work to achieve the vote for African Americans. And those traditions continue afterwards.
In 1880, he pops back up in Jersey City. It's not his home of Belvedere, but it is New Jersey. And so that brings up a lot of questions. What happened? Did he realize that even staying here, he could not make advances or create the life that he wanted? In considering the differences and the similarities of both Joseph Moore's stories, I think one thing that bridges them together is this question of, what does it mean to be American? We have these two different individuals who show up together on a document through a shared occupation, a shared name. But in one way where their experiences diverge is where we know from the records of the Irish Joseph Moore that his family and his descendants eventually became more enmeshed and became part of New York City. We know that they were able to leave the tenements and move. And even just being able to have a record of their descendants kind of clues us into life that happened afterwards. New York never truly opened up in the 19th century for him. In some ways, it may have became more hostile than it was when he initially arrived. The Irish Moors are able to realize what one might consider the American dream, where someone who is born in the United States, born just cities away from New York City, is still never considered a citizen. We meet them in the same place, but we leave them in different respects.
New York City for the nation has often stood as the place of greatest freedom. Looking back at this period with less romance and more critical engagement can help us understand some of these pernicious and long-lasting legacies of racism. The ways in which different groups were set against each other. We're told that this country means one thing to this group and another thing to that group. And it's not to be shared. That if you succeed as a European immigrant, congratulations, and remember, do not share that success with African Americans. This idea of New York as a place to be free was very different for those two sets of groups. They did not have the same access to equality, to freedom, to citizenship. If we can be a little more critical about how that differed for these two groups, we can then begin to be a little bit more conscious about how to undo some of these inequities.
These stories don't exist separately in vacuums. They're all melded together in really complicated ways. And the opportunity to tell these stories in those more complicated ways is exciting to me.
Why is it important for the Tenement Museum right at this moment to incorporate someone like Joseph Moore? Is because we are getting better as a nation, as institutions, whether educational, university settings, or museums, other institutions, to tell an honest, holistic story about what this nation is and how we are all interconnected in all of the beautiful and horrific ways that this country has brought us together. The Tenement Museum is excavating some of these important narratives of families to help us really feel connected to this larger, longer story of what it means to be American.